Our presenter this evening is Paul Taylor, who is an OU MBA alumni. Paul has over 25 years experience in change management consultancy. Some of you will have heard Paul last January when he spoke around the subject, why does change really fail? Tonight, Paul will delve a little deeper into the subject when he looks at the theory versus practice, and I must admit I'm very much looking forward to this, Paul. So it's over to you, and if you'd like to tell us a bit more about your background, Paul.
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Janet?
Oh, we can, thank you, Paul.
Yeah, that's excellent. So welcome everybody. I'll just move to the first slide. So just to run through the high level agenda really. So the first item, I'll just run you through a bit about me, shamelessly sell myself. And then I'll just hopefully take you on a journey through what is change. Probably most people already know, but it's always worthwhile having a refresher. Then run through how successful change is. Then that will hopefully logically, if my notes are working correctly, drop into the theory of change. And then we can look at what's the difference between change theory and what happens. I use it very loosely in the real world. And then we can do a wrap up and a summary at the end. So if we just talk about, just give a 30-second overview of who I is. Not wanting to read the slides, I've been working in change management, primarily in the financial services industry, but I've also done work in oil and gas, film production and charity, for over 25 years now, probably near 30 years now, quite frightening really. I do a number of other pro bono roles for the Chartered Management Institute. I'm responsible for membership engagement for their 20-odd thousand members in South East London and South East. I do some book reviews for the Management Year of the Book Award. And the other items probably worthwhile mentioning, which is the third bullet point from the end, is my link to the Open University, particularly the Open University Business School, goes back to 1999, which seems only yesterday to me, but probably a lifetime for some of you people on the call, where I did my MBA and the certificate and diploma before that. Since then, I've also done the certificate in web app, which was done about 7 years ago. Other work I do, I'm a non-executive for a film production company, and I'm at the moment very slowly working my way through a doctorate at Middlesex University in North London. So worthwhile. Now we can get into the crux of the presentation. The first item is to run through what we think change is. I know most people probably understand what it is, but it's worthwhile because it's quite the whole backbone and usefulness of the whole of the of this discussion. So, what the alteration? So, this definition I tend to use is an alteration to an organisation's activity. It can be any sort of change. It can be a tangible change, where you're building a new building or implementing a new system, or it can be anything quite intangible, which can cover things like a cultural change or a behavioural change, or something in between. You could have an outsourcing which requires system changes, but also behaviour and cultural changes. And the other thing is, and it's a rather crude quote, change as usual, but I quite like it actually, by Collins and Scaffield back in 1993, is that they came up with this fantastic play on words based on like the business as usual as change as usual, which implies change is not a one-off activity, but it's happening all the time. And therefore it's imperative for organisations that they need to manage change successfully. Always live or die, to quote the phrase. So anyway, so moving on to how change is successful. Change is, before I get into the yes or no, the change is a massive industry around change. There's lots of consultancy firms, and I somewhat, which is where I work, which I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. There's training courses, training manuals, academic papers, there's videos, there's blogs, there's user groups, professional bodies. It's change itself is probably as big as any industry there is in the UK. But I think I'm quite willing to say that change has a very poor record of implementation. Cotter in 1995 indicated that only 30% of change programs were successful, and McKinsey supported that in 2008, and I can't remember the exact stats what he said, but he was around about 30 to 29%.
Paul, can I just stop you a minute? I'm not sure why, but we're getting a bit of poor sound from your mic. Could you try refreshing?
Is that okay, or?
there is a tiny little bit of feedback still, but it is better than it was. I'm not sure why that is.
That's all right. We'll carry. If anything else comes back, or we just
that's better.
Yeah. Anyway, there seems to be something called Anne Crandall's one that appears to be talking, or maybe there might.
I think that might be it. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yes. Can I ask everybody to turn their mics off because it interferes with the sound? And you can do this by clicking the talk button above the participants panel. Thank you very much.
Okay.
That's better. Thank you very much, all of you. Okay, Paul. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, please do. No. So going back to the item, changes of poor representation, just recap on that because that's where the feedback clicked in. Cotter, 1995, was an all-round management consultant, Boffin, said that only 30% of change programs are successful, and this was supported by McKinsey, who are a rather large and expensive US consulting firm in 2008, so it's a lot nearer, also supported this argument. But why? And therefore, what I'm going to try and do over the rest of the slide is try to explore this issue by comparing change theory against change practice. So, first of all, let's have a look at the theory of change. And change theory is a big area, as I've mentioned before, and I've tried to split it into two main areas, and these aren't probably the best two ways of splitting it. You can probably split it into 2, 3, 4 different areas. But I thought I'll have to stick the stake in the ground. So firstly, looking at the actual academic theory, and it's very interesting word, theory and academic. Because if you take the definition, is that the theory itself is a set of principles or an idea that has some sort of test that's proven it's right. So that can range for anything from Einstein to, I don't know, physics or something like that. Also, the word theory and academic can be an insult, along the lines of, we've got this process and it's okay in theory, which means a lot of people have some sort of negative connotation about theory and often ignore it and try to reject it. So, go back looking at the slide now, there is a large amount of theory literature on change, and that's models, academic journals, practitioner papers, case studies, and I can't remember the exact stats off the head, but if you go into Google and you just do a search on change theory or change models, you'll get hundreds and hundreds of thousands of responses, and admittedly some of them are actually duplicates, but there are a large amount now. So, but the literature itself tends to be sourced from the academic world or consultancy world, and the advantage of that is that those two tend to overlap. And you get a massive wide range of it. Some of the literature theory is very complex, and I'm going to run you through some of the models later on in the next slide, but some of it is very high level and simple. So if we just go and look at, I've probably got 4 models, and ranging from some very simple ones to ones that are so complicated they make the tube network look like a piece of cake. So this is Lewin, or Kurt Lewin, to give me his full name. He was a management theory back in the 1950s. And he came up with a very famous model. I've called it the 3 steps model, but you can call it the 3 phases, the three steps of change. And the first idea is the unfreeze, move, or refreeze, and sometimes it's called unfreeze, change, refreeze. And the idea is, you unfreeze, you release the organisation and get it ready to change, and then when you move, you actually make the change. And the idea is that when you do the refreeze, you actually implement the change or make the change stick. And this is a very famous model that's been around for ages. And I know from memory, there was a MBA, probably I think that's in one of the books on that. The second model is a slightly more involved model, actually, and it's by Bullock and Batten, and it's a similar type thing. It just basically says you've got 4 stages: exploration, planning, action, and integration. And it's very similar. The exploration is almost like you verify the need to change. What change do we need? The planning side, you actually make the changes or determine what the changes needs to be done. Then you have some feedback and implement the change. And integration, where you try and embed the change. So it's very similar, but slightly an extra box, but the same concept's the same. Then you get onto the 4th one, and apologies is a bit blurred, so no need to adjust your TV sets. It's probably my incompetence in PowerPoint. And this becomes a little bit more complex, and it's looking at change and more of a transformation than implementing the change. And it looks at those 4 boxes in the centre, linked to each other, I believe, where it looks at the intangible side of stuff, like the informal organisation, you know, politics, power bases, and just below it the people, you know, the politics and people's need to make change. And to the left and the right, or the east and the west, depending how you want to look at it, you've got work and the formal organisation. So this one is moving away from like a much more sort of like a step 1, step 2, step 3, and it's actually looking at changes as a transformation process involving a lot of intangible stuff as well as tangible stuff. And this other one is, I quite like this one actually. It's mainly because it's actually so simple and it actually covers quite a lot. And it's Williams-Briggs Managing Transition model. And basically what that involves is a change is sort of like an overlapping process. And it's very similar to Kurt Lewin's, where the ending, losing, letting go, that's almost the unfreeze. The neutral zone is probably implementing the change, and the new beginning. Well, is probably next to the refreeze. But what they're trying to do there, they're just trying to understand, it's not trying to understand, they're trying to portray the fact that change isn't a step process, it's an overlap process that takes time. And, you know, if you go to the very right, the new beginning, you know, it's still got some ending, losing and letting go stuff at the bottom. So again, that becomes more a sort of slightly complex model. And then moving on to this one here, which is a big jump forward in complexity, and actually, not want to sound like a complete geek, is actually probably one of my favourite models. And what it involves is, it's Berkeley, I beg your pardon. It's very complicated, and I mean the number of arrows on there are a ridiculous number of arrows and number of boxes. But if you do read into this one, and I would recommend at least maybe trying to get one of the simpler explanations, it's actually very clever. It looks at change in a much wider context. Is that change involves or change, successful change needs a number of bodies implemented. You know, you need to have looking at the top, which is a white screen, sort of like a light blue, is that, you know, you need mission strategy and leadership and organisational culture that needs to be correct. That feeds the structure, practices and systems and policies, and moves all the way down. So it implies that change itself isn't a sort of like a step process, but more of an ongoing pattern that involves a number of interacting bodies. And again, it is quite a complex model, but I do recommend people having a read of that. Out of all the models, it is my favourite. So I could go through and I could have PowerPointed in 100 more models. I could have probably sat here for another 2 hours talking about them. But I think what the key thing is, though, there's a number of things you can take away from change. The first thing to remember is that the theory does have some very useful inputs into change management, such as the importance of preparation, change that needs to be made to stick, change into the journey and stakeholder management. I've got change as a journey there again. So it's important that you don't just dismiss, or not we, but we don't dismiss theory as rubbish, you know, only works in theory type attitude, because there's a lot of good stuff in there. But there are some issues. I mean, the individual models themselves tend to focus on individual parts of change. For example, there's various models out there that focus on stakeholder management, some of them focus on human behaviour, some of them focus on planning. And so they're all quite bitty, for want of a better word. But also some of the models I personally think are too simplistic. For example, you have things along the lines of, you know, the first model, Lewin's model. It's is it freeze, unfreeze, unfreeze, change, and freeze. You know, change is far more complex than that. There's thousands of elements, personal, people elements, intangible, tangible elements. Also, a lot of these models tend to be quite generic. You know, beg pardon, tend to be too linear. You know, it's do 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, which is fine in practice, in theory. I've quoted myself, but in practice this change has many different directions, feedback loops, parallel pieces of work, stopping and starting. It's a very complex thing. And the other point, as I tend to pick up, is it's very generic. First of all, a lot of these models don't focus on the different types of change. For example, you could have one type of change could be a system upgrade, which is actually one type of change. Another thing you could have is change where you're doing a lot of downcasting, down-sourcing, which require a large amount of softness, or you could have something in between, like you're doing outsourcing where you've got system changes and as well as hard changes as well. And also, while they focus on different types of change, they don't tend to focus on industry specifics. So the dynamics of the oil industry, if you go and work with Shell or BP, is very different to the dynamics of working for JP Morgan Bank or Barclays Bank. Likewise, if you work for the UK government, it's very different to working from British Airways or EasyJet or Ryanair. So again, while the models are quite good, they do have some issues. Furthermore, some of them have key things missing, which is probably the worrying thing from my point of view. First of all, a lot of the models don't really assess what triggers change. There's no sort of why are we doing it. There's also no way. A lot of the models also, not say skip, but they sort of work around or ignore what makes change successful. I.e., basically how you're going to go away and tell your boss you want your bonus because you've done the change. They don't often reflect the complexity of change. Anyone who's done any change project, whether it's an IT project or anything else, you know it's hard work and there's thousands and thousands of issues to run. And likewise, as I sort of mentioned previously on the previous slide, they do not reflect any specific issues of change. So again, they are sort of like quite vanilla. So, I think we've got our first poll here, Jen, haven't we?
We have, yes. I've just switched the poll on, so if you'd all like to have a read through, and Paul will read through the poll for you, and you can have a vote, and I can let you all know what the results are.
Yeah, I was just quite curious. I think this is the first of two polls, actually. So basically, I was just quite curious which change models have people used during their professional career. And when I say career, maybe if you've done OU work or other work, I'm just very curious because, as I said before, when you go into these models, there's hundreds of thousands, there's tens of thousands of them, and I'm just curious what ones people have used. So I think A for Lewin, B for bullet batten plan change, C for Nadir Hushman, and D for other.
I'll just give people a few moments longer to, I think a fair few people have voted, but there might be a few people still left to vote.
Yeah.
A few people have actually voted in the chat panel. So I'll stop the poll and see what the results are.
I think we've got 5 for A.
Bear with me one moment.
5 for A, 6 for A actually, I think.
There we go. Let's have a look. Yep, and we also, as I say, I'm not sure if these people actually put them in the, they put them in the chat. There's one here for C, one for D, another one for D, and another one for A. So, yeah.
Yeah, so it looks A.
So planned change isn't the favourite.
No, I don't want to look at Batten really. That's a shame. I'll have to have a word with them. So Lewin, to be honest with you, I'm not surprised that it hasn't come out the top, but A is quite commonly used. And secondly, I think the Open University included it in their textbooks, so they did last century when I was doing it. So I wouldn't be surprised. The Bullock batten plan change, again, not that, but I'm surprised that's got no one actually. I thought it might be 1 or 2, just maybe a sympathy vote, if nothing else. Again, because that's probably not that common and it's very similar to Lewin. C, which was the Nadir Tushman type thing. I'm just trying to find my notes. Yeah, again, surprised that's got a few on there. Not surprised there's a few on there. That's obviously there's quite a large people use that. And D, I'm surprised because I couldn't put every single model on here because apart from the fact Janet would probably kill me, the list would be far too long. So that's interesting stuff. So it's probably worthwhile now. If it's okay to move on now, Janet. Yeah. So I just press the button. Yeah.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. Thank you, Paul.
Okay. So moving on to, as I mentioned earlier, we spoke about sort of like academic theories, but also in parallel to this, which is probably not always been put under the theory thing. There's what I call mythologies. And these are, some of these are quite good, some of them not so good, interesting in people's views. These tend to be large change mythologies or change processes, and they tend to originate, typo on there, from the practitioner world. And they're large ones. I mean, I've got things like waterfall, which tends to be a software development one. I know business people call that as well. critical path methods, agile, which has a large number of different names depending on what agencies you work for, event change methodology, probably the world famous Prince, and even more famous Prince 2, and there's other things like lean and what have you. There's loads more. I mean, again, we could put a list, and a lot of them overlap. And for example, I know waterfall is also a part of Prince 2. And there's a lot of bullshit as well. So there are a lot of bingos around that as well. And it's just trying to get focus on those. But the methodologies are useful, and they are. I mean, they do provide the structure and the roadmap to follow, and they do provide some governance control. But as you can guess, there is. Oops. Let me go that one. There is a however. They do have some issues. They can be very large and complex to understand. I mean, Prince 2 is. In Prince 2, the book itself is about a foot thick. You know, it is a heavy thing, and other ones, and you will need specialist training to follow them. Personally, I've always found these methodologies, on the whole, I mean, slightly generalised statement, tend to be aimed towards large change in organisations. Again, like Prince 2 was actually, Prince itself, I think, was originally back in the 80s, because I can remember that long, was actually written for the UK government. They can also be perceived as red tape processes, you know, where the form fill-in and the status reports become more important than the change. And also, the other thing that comes up, which I've noticed, and I'm as guilty as the next person, is organisations do not fully implement the processes. So they will pick bits from the process they like they'll actually do a waterfall process, but try and run it as agile. And the issue there is that, again, these methodologies will provide some input into change, but obviously, you know, they need to sort of like take a practitioner point of view. So if you move on to the differences between change and change theory, so obviously on the previous 6-7 slides, we've covered what I think the view of change theory is, and just to sort of recap really. Change theory provides some inputs to make a change successful. I'm not going to say it hasn't, and there's a bullet points there which I've almost cut and pasted from the previous slide. But I think the key point to remember is you need to merge or close the gap, to use the thing, between the change theory and the real world experiences or practitioner experiences to ensure that change is successful. So what I've done is taken some of the good bits, I think, from the change theories, and not just the ones on the list, but all the other ones I've reviewed over the many decades I've been doing this, and pulled it together with some of the practitioner stuff I've been doing to try and pull together a sort of like a mini checklist or process, just that hopefully we can use to close the gap between theory and good practice. So moving on to the next slide. So I've got a large diagram there with an arrow, to be honest. So 3 main items there. You've got left to right, what is driving the change, what is defining the change, and implementing the change. So basically it's almost like a 3-step process. So I've borrowed something from Lewin to try and keep it simple. And if we look at the very first one, what is driving change? So the key question here is before you actually do anything, the question is, and I can see what my underline is, why are we doing this? Why are we bothering? Why are we going to get people in at weekends? Why are we going to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds and turn every hair grey to do this change? Because you don't have a real clear reason of why you're doing this change. And there's actually, you've got to ask the question: is it worthwhile? Once you've actually got this, we can then understand why you're doing it. We can actually move on to how do we measure it. Because you might say we're going to the reason we're going to do the change is to say £10,000 a year on costs. Then you can measure it. So basically, if you've got a very clear reason why you're doing it, you can actually understand why you're doing it, then you can understand how to measure it. Once that's done, you understand why you're doing it, you can move on to defining the change. This has a number of different elements to it, and there's 3 main elements, and this is really the scope, to use a phrase. So there's a number of areas here. So the first item relates to essentially organisational dynamics, is understanding what dynamics in the organisation need to be changed. So you could have soft issues, for example, do we have to make any cultural changes? Do we have to loosen any power bases? Do we need to change any behaviours? You know, if you do an organisational change to make a company more customer friendly, then you may need to do those things. Any hard issues, as in tangible issues, as opposed to hard and not easy, you know, is there anything we need to do? Things like reporting line, do we need to change any legal structures? The next thing is, once you understand the dynamics, you can almost define into what, I call it types of change, probably not the best title, but understanding things like what actually needs to change within the organisations. For example, soft versus hard, we sort of discussed. But is there anything around things like anything internally to the organisation needs to be changed, any external items that need to be changed? So internal could be, you know, legal structures, systems, behaviours. External, you may need to get suppliers to change something. You may need to get customers to operational differences. And last but not least, under that area, you have tactical versus strategic. And these are probably two of the most misused words ever. So I always look at tactical changes as anything that's like a day-to-day small change, and strategic, anything long-term. Probably not. I imagine all the 20 odd people on the call can come up with two different definitions. But if it's a tactical change, if you're looking to implement it quickly, sharply and fast. If you're doing strategic change, you've probably still got to implement it reasonably quickly, but you've probably got a little bit more reflection time. And last but not least, under there, the third block of changes is industry specifics. You've got to understand, if you're working, different industries have different ways of working. You tend to find financial services tends to work probably reasonably quickly, get things done. You know, they want things done 6 to 5, they measure things in months. If you're working in the oil industry, it tends to be slightly slower, mainly because if you're playing around with an oil rig, the last thing you want to do is cut corners, because otherwise you'll have a big fire on your hands. And the last one is government changes. Government is, I mean, having worked in the civil service many years, it's actually quite tricky, because you could be going down one trajectory, you get a change happening, and the next thing you know is you're going the other way, changing government or Brexit or something like that. So you need to understand different drivers and different specifics of the industry. And the other thing is to understand across industry issues. For example, you could be, for example, working for the government, implementing some new legislation. That legislation could be impacting financial services. So you've got to understand that two organisations will work very differently. And the piece of work I did many years ago for the Financial Services Authority, I worked with the government on implementing legislation around liquidity management. Those remember the credit crunch. And it was the government were very much, not slow, but a very considered approach for financial services firms and really getting quite aggressive when it had been done quickly. And it was a big stakeholder issue we had to sort out. So, but by defining the change, it allows you to answer 3 things. It allows you firstly to understand who needs to be involved. You know, people's teams, customers, suppliers, regulators, you know, anybody else. Then you can understand of what needs to be changed. So you, again, I've used tangible versus intangible. So you have technology, legal, processes, and you know, you have intangible items such as cultural behaviours. And the other thing, which is often the thing that's completely missed out, and again, I can put my hand up, if I was on video, you can see my hand in there, is understanding how the change should be managed. One of the biggest reasons for change failure, from my personal point of view, and again, I'm guilty, is misunderstanding the culture of the change. You know, you'll go in, you've worked at a big organisation all your life, you go to a small organisation and you try and implement it in the same way, and it's total anarchy, or it just doesn't work, or in some of those cases I've seen people walk out the door. Or vice versa, you're in a small organisation and then you go to a large organisation and you completely misunderstand all the politics and the processes and all the different dynamics. So it's really important to understand the culture of the organisation where the change is being made.
Paul,
also
can I just stop you for a minute? We've got a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, Paul. We've got a question come in from Richard. Is there a difference between establishing KSFs and benefit realisation? Thank you, Richard.
Sorry, Richard, I had a bit of paper over that bit of the screen. I do apologise. Yes, the KSFs, for those, just is key success factors, I guess, and benefit realisation is obviously realising the benefits. I would personally, I think they're the same actually. I mean, it's really, if you're going to do a change, whatever change, let's do an example, I don't know, my team's West Ham, they moved to a new stadium. So their change was to move their football ground from Upton Park to the Olympic Stadium. So the benefits for them is a number of things, bigger support base, more tickets sold, more beer sold, more pie sold, greater press, more PR, I call it a word. So I think the key thing there is you can say that the benefits really are slightly vaguer and more intangible. But I think the KSF is trying to put a sort of like a quantitative measure around them. So while they are probably slightly different, they are probably the same. That answers your question, Richard.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, cool. So I think we're done there. So basically, and then the final item is moving on to the far right-hand screen, is implementing the change. So you've now understand what is driving the change, i.e. why you're doing it. Second thing is defining the change, i.e. what has to be changed. And now you're implementing the change, which is actually rolling your sleeves up, working all the hours that God sends, hopefully on a good overtime rate, and actually implementing the change. Again, I've split this into 5 main blocks. There's 3 on this pad, and there's 3 on the next pad. So the first one is leadership factors. And this is, if you're making a change, you need your leaders, whether they are the senior exec or the team lead or anybody who's visible or anybody with any power base, to have clear, visible support from senior management. So they've got to make emails, they've got to do presentations, they've got to support the change, and that really makes a difference. And in the previous, I worked at a bank previously, finished a couple of months ago, and we had a very supportive head of Europe who would send out regular emails thanking us for our work whenever it went right, supporting the change. And the amount of buy-in you get down the chain on that is actually amazing. The second factor is the organisational factors. And that relates to back to how you manage the change. It's ensuring you have the right governance in place. You look forums to guide and agree high-level change controls and your organisation on the ground changes. I think the key thing there you've got to bear in mind is you just need to match the organisation. If you've got a small firm, 30 odd people, and you're going to implement mass governance, forget it, it won't work. But if you've got a change, you're implementing a big change across 100,000 person organisations spread across 40 locations and 25 different time zones, etc., then that would be good. You do need that. The next item is human factors, and that is managing people through the change. So basically you need to manage resistance, and you need to manage resistance in a number of ways. Firstly, you can completely ignore it, which I don't really recommend because it does foster and foster. The second thing is to sort of tackle it, which I've always done, generally try and tackle it straight on. You need to understand what people are resisting for, why they're not happy, why they don't do the change. And I think there's a chap called John Piermont Morgan, who was the original JP Morgan actually. He said there's two reasons why people resist. The first reason is a very articulate reason that makes sense and logical. And the second reason is the real reason. So really you need to get through to the real reason, which requires just trying a number of bit of tactful questioning. And once you get to the bottom of resistance, it's actually, most of it, 90% of it always makes sense. Don't worry about the job, they don't know what's going to happen. Don't worry, they've got to send the children to university, they lose their job. There's some good stuff in there, and it's completely honest. The other one, you need to sort of have a culture to support change, which basically means it makes it open, etc. And the other one, which links to leadership factors, is having an ongoing flow of communication. Again, people, if they don't hear anything, they will make up their own mind, and if they don't hear anything, they will make up their own mind, and if they don't hear anything, make up their own mind, you can bet your mortgage it's going to be bad news. So that's the first 3. The next 2 are change-specific factors. Again, this comes down to more than nitty-gritty. Really, if you're doing a change, each change has its own list of things that need to be done, and it's appropriate to change being implemented. So again, if you're building an oil rig, you're going to have very different dynamics, implementation speed, dynamics, and triggers of change than if you're moving a factory or you're building a new running track around the stadium. And last but not least, you just need to understand the general way the industry works. I use PEST there: political, economic, social, and technology. Again, it's understanding, again, just to not want to repeat myself, if you work for an oil firm, the dynamics are going to be very different from a financial firm, that's going to be very different from a sports firm, that'll be very different from a political firm. So, that covers the main areas, and there's one final point is, and it's not really ever covered in the theory, which is actually quite weird, really. I think, I mean, they use a phrase that my old mother used to tell me, the devil is in the detail. Change is complex. It's basically, if you think of change, there's a million things happening at once. You know, it could be anywhere from software being written, debugged, tested, legal contracts being negotiated, processes being written. So the people who tend to change very well, and I'm not sure whether I include myself in that or not, are very good at managing the details, and it's trying to make sure you're keeping track of all the details. So I think that's a very key point. So we move on to summary, but I noticed, Janet, a few questions have appeared on the left. Is it worthwhile to go through them now? Or?
Well, they have, but Richard would like to have a chat with you when we finish recording, if that's all right. Well, actually, I could ask you now, if that's okay with Richard. Yeah. He's asking, he's responsible for outlining and measuring benefit realization, and he was wondering if you could give your thoughts on potential models or templates for that. Yeah, or is that too on the spot? Sorry, Paul.
It's a little bit on the spot. What I can do is, I mean, I don't know, Richard, I think it's okay for three of us to hang on the line afterwards. I think your
suggestion,
that's what you suggested, didn't you? So,
yeah, okay. Yeah. That's it then. We'll have a chat about that later. Okay.
Right. So we're almost there now, folks. So on the summary slide, so just to recap what we've done, again, I don't want to change theory does provide useful insights. I mean, it's very easy, I said before, to criticise theories out, and we've all done it, and I'm probably still do it. But they do have drawbacks. It tends to be focus on individual elements of change, tends to be too simplistic, linear, and sometimes too generic. And likewise, while some of those change management methodologies they're all good, they're very good, but they are complex and they are very hard to implement and to use. And again, for some organisations that is not appropriate. And if a small organisation or a very fluid organisation, they don't work and they become red tapes. So I think therefore it's important to understand that any theory needs to be combined with, I call it real world, which sounds ever so arrogant, but it's not meant to be, ensuring that change is successful. And the three questions I've always asked, the approach I do when I go into any consultancy, is really understand what is driving the changes or the change. I mean, I normally walk in and say something very jokingly. If I'm going to ask for a new bonus, please tell me what I've got to do to win the bonus. The next one is, once you know why you're doing the change, it allows you to drop down and define the change. It could be quite a wide range of stuff. It could be hundreds of things that need to be done. And then you get down to implementing the change, and obviously that where it comes to understanding what needs to go on. And one thing that the lesson I've always learned, and I've been taught many times, is the devil is in the detail. It's very nice having all these processes and having it all defined. You've got nice diagrams showing how to implement it. You've got a fantastic project plan. But when it comes down to the details, you've got somebody, and it's probably me and all the other folk on the line, roll up your sleeves and get on with it. So you need to manage to change in a lot of detail. And I think...
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. We've actually got another question about top management support. What is the real-world equivalent of burning your ships?
Right, I think burning ships, make sure I understand the phrase. I think that's something to do with William the Conqueror. Well, it wasn't the Conqueror at the time, but isn't it something burnt his ships or put holes in the ships so people couldn't escape back?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, burning a ship relates to, from my point of view, again, a bet your company type thing. So you're going to implement the change. I think the more prominent the change is, a large bet your company type change, maybe something we're trying to think of a good example, like a new version of an iPhone coming out for Apple or something like that. If that's a disaster, Apple will be in serious trouble. And the other thing will be, I think the bigger the change, the more impacts the organisation, the more basically more visible management support you need, really. So. Yeah.
And I just noticed actually that SE has given some advice here for Richard. He says, if it helps, MSP is good for covering this. I've just done the course and the tutor said Google Benefits Realization and the NHS do a really simple but effective form for capturing and monitoring benefits. So thank you for that. That's interesting.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, that's good.
I have got one quick question. It's probably a very basic and obvious one, so I do apologise to you all. But I'm very aware that we always talk about the change happening because of the external environment. Does it ever happen internally, do you think, Paul? You know, does change happen because somebody, you know, at the top, the leader wants it to happen?
I think so. I mean, it's a tricky one, actually, because you do get... and first, I answered did a presentation. Not a presentation. I was asked about this the other week actually, and I suppose that I use the word theory again. Theory is any internal change should be driven by an external factor. You know, or a manager. Let's say, for example, a new CEO comes in. You know, a new person at Apple, he wants to come in, or a new person at Microsoft will come in and then reorganise the organisation because he wants to make it work better than the external organisation. But in pragmatic terms, I think some changes are done internally that don't seem to be driven externally. You know, whether they're internal politics or just down to the ego of the management or just a better way of working. So I think there is internal driven change, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. That was really interesting. If I could ask you to just click on to the next slide, so I can thank you. Just to let you know, everyone, the OU do online short courses, 25-hour courses, and they have one on managing change, which you can start at any time. So if you are interested, you can go to that website there. And don't worry, I will be sending out the slides later, and the link, so you can go and have a look if you want it. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you all for attending this evening, and thank you, Paul. Another fascinating session from you. I really want to thank you. I'm going to stop the recording now so that you and Richard can discuss a bit further the models, and if anybody else wants to join in, they're welcome to stay as well. Thank you all.